All right. Writer Sam Foster, thank you for being here today. In my researching your bio, it seems like writing is something you wanted to do from the beginning, and then you had some other things that came up, one of them being the Marine Corps military service, and then eventually you've gotten to write. You have a couple books out, and you're doing historical fictions, it looks like now. How goes writing on timelines?
That's a pretty good summary of my career. Although the one thing I might add to you, because I know, TR, that you have told me your audience is interested in creative process, that the reason I didn't start writing when I was young wasn't that I wasn't interested. It was that I didn't grow up with money. My family, I didn't think of us as poor, but I slept on the couch until my older sister went away left home. And so as I became an adult, I wanted money, and I wasn't willing to live in a cold upstairs apartment and starve for art. So the truth of the matter is I just wasn't that dedicated to the process. I wanted, in fact, to make my life a little more financially comfortable. And it was when I was at the point in life that most of us get to at one point or another, where the mortgage was by and large paid off. I had my kids paid through college. I was building up a little IRA and a few accounts. It wasn't until I was comfortable that I let myself start to write. And then I kind of unleashed the horse, but I had held it in check until then.
Yeah, that seems like what it's like in just the history of civilization, where you have to take care of the necessaries before you can start exploring more of the artistic side of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I know there are people who are not like that, who will starve for their art, but I just wasn't driven that hard. But I will say and add to it that I stopped business 7 years ago. I have in common with Raymond Chandler that we both wrote our first two books while we were executives of downtown Los Angeles firms. And I wrote my first couple of books. I would literally go to the LA library, which was right across the street over lunch, and find a little corner cubicle. They have a little reading room. And my second book, I wrote almost entirely in the LA library while I was working. But 7 years ago, I was able to simply quit all that commercial activity and devote myself entirely to my passion. And it is my passion. I'm happier now and more content than I have ever been in my life, because what I do is get up in the morning and either have conversations with people like you, or when you and I are done for the day, I will work on the edit of what is now my sixth book. And that has brought me such a sense of peace and contentment, I can't tell you, TR.
Yeah, it's interesting because with writing, for me, and I think a lot of people I've talked to, it seems like a thing that if you don't have, you hear a lot where people say, write what you know. And if you haven't done anything, then you don't really know a lot unless you're connected into some sort of something where ideas come from outside of you. But you have to definitely have accomplished something or lived through some things or seen some things, experienced life, to be able to figure out what you want to write about and then write it. And oftentimes you have to wait until that story bubbles up inside of you, where you hear a lot of people say they just didn't have a choice but to write it. But you get that urge so much that once you start, you can't look at the end of it and say a book is a long way away, but you just take that little piece at a time and you just put it together. And if you've accomplished things in your life, you can see how you can accomplish writing a book.
TR, you speak to my life almost like you were my neighbor or my friend. But my first two books were about things that I absolutely knew. I was in the commercial real estate business. And my first book is about a real estate hustle set in the RTC days in the 80s in Southern California. And one reviewer described it as a scenic tour of Southern California because it runs from mountains to ocean. I mean, I just move the scenes around because I have discovered as a writer that most of writing is conversation. Most of it is what people say. But if I simply write a story where everybody sits in offices like you and I are right now, TR, and talk to each other, that's dead ass boring. So if I move it around, so one day we're playing golf, one day we're fishing for marlin, one day we're in church, one day we're in whatever, it's simply more interesting. But my first one was about something I had worked in for 30 years. And my second book was about the Marine Corps. And even though it is fictional, it is absolutely based on my experience in the Marine Corps. So the first two books I wrote fit precisely to the paradigm that you just stated. They were about things that I understood very well. And with my book about the Marine Corps, it's set in 1969. And I say on the inside cover of that book that and I wrote that book incidentally the book came out in 2014. So what's that, a 40 or 45 year lap between the and the book? And I say in the book that I understood everything that happened in 1969, but I didn't know what it meant. And it took me 40 years to come to understand what those experiences and those pressures on men actually meant. But both books were about things I knew very, very well. And only after I had gotten a little comfortable with the fact that I could actually write, did I write a story that had been in my mind for a very long time, a very long time. And the truth of the matter was that I wanted to write it so desperately that at one point I described it as saying that God had put me on earth to tell that story. And I know that's a little saccharine and a little silly, but it meant that much to me. And I didn't start writing it until I wasn't doing other work, so I could simply devote myself to it. That if I got going and the muse was sitting on my shoulder and it took me until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I had to get up at 4:30 in the morning to go to work, I couldn't have done it. But if I didn't have anything else to do, I could do that. And that was historic fiction. And I think I have now written 3 books of historic fiction and in the process of editing the 4th. And I think that's my lane, TR. I think I'll probably stay in that lane the rest of my life. It's the place I'm most comfortable and feel the most joy.
I agree. My dog also agrees.
Oslo, that's your dog's name?
No, also she
okay.
agrees.
Got
Yeah,
it.
her name's Tia Beanie, after the cartoon.
Okay.
Let me see if I can settle her down here.
It's kind of cute for background noise, and it's not that loud that it's disruptive, at least to me. So.
We live on a golf course, so she has these boundary line where if a golf cart gets certainly too close to her fence, then it's a problem, and she has to let them know. But
your protector.
Yeah,
you go get him, girl.
She's I think she just moved in maybe 6 months ago, maybe less than that. But she's a 10-year-old Jack Russell Terrier, maybe,
Yep.
or a Rat Terrier. And
Yep.
I haven't
I know Jack Russells.
Yeah, I haven't had the hunting dog type before, and she is definitely a hunter. So she likes to patrol things, check boundaries, and alert everyone of if the trash is getting picked up or if there's somebody playing golf too close to the house.
Yeah.
So she's settling in. So historic fiction.
Even after she gets settled in, she'll be protective of that fence line.
Oh yeah. Yeah. She patrols up and down it when we go out. That's her first thing she does. And if she catches a scent of anything, she'll alert you and then chase the scent. So we have possums and muskrats and things that pass through every now and then that she'll have to show you where they went.
Which you need protection, TR.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. We had been without a dog for about a year, and then now we have this one. So we'll see how it goes. Historical fictions. When you're picking to write a fiction, a historical fiction, how do you pick your time frame or like time that you're going to write it, the story you're going to tell? Is it from experience where you can see a story and say, okay, this is something I know about, so I can adapt it over into this, and I can have some insight into what's going on, or is it different than that?
The answer to your question is sometimes, and that is to say, sometimes it's what you said, and sometimes it's not. But really, two different things. The trilogy that I wrote, and this is the current one, but it's the last book in a trilogy. And I very much think of it as a single story. And when I originally wrote it, it was 1,300 pages. And the publishing company made it real clear that Americans do not read Tolstoy-esque length novels anymore. That doesn't happen. And so even though I thought of it as one story, it indeed did divide pretty neatly into 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And there was some editing that had to be done to make that transition, but the story broke up okay. And I will admit about the story, in writing it as one story, but publishing it three, it's almost like writing a play. The second book is the weakest book because the second book is simply a bridge. It's not really a story in its own. I've tried to make it that way. But the first book sets the dilemma. The last book resolves the dilemma. And the middle book is not uninteresting. In fact, it's got the most interesting character I've ever written. But it's clearly just a bridge between the two. And that story is a story that I grew up with. My ancestral home is a small river port on the Illinois River. And when I say small, during the 19th century, it was a huge river port. And almost everything that happened in the middle of Illinois, all transportation was water then before the rails came in. And everything that came in to build the Capitol in Springfield came in through that little port. I mean, it was rich and it was prosperous and it was the place. And then, like many places in the Midwest, it declined in the 20th century. But I had grown up with those stories and those tales about this place becoming a place, going from wilderness to being something, and then the decline of it. And TR, I didn't want to write that story when I couldn't devote myself to it. So literally, I held off on writing it. But the book that I am working on now and about to finish editing on was simply a story that I saw in the Los Angeles Times, of all things, about a 16th century Italian woman. And I absolutely fell in love with the story, not so much her, but the story. And so I simply put it in a file drawer. And I said, when I'm through with what I'm doing now, I'm going to come back to this. So sometimes they come out of my own inspiration. That was my experience. And sometimes they simply come to me through the air, and there it's it. And I say, I'm fascinated. I want to write that. And I have now got 6 files of stories that kind of interest me. And when I see something on the internet that's about it, I throw it in the file. And maybe I'll get to it and maybe I won't. But the inspiration already sits there in my file drawer. So I know that's not a very straight answer to your question, but that's kind of what my process has been.
Yeah, it's sitting there, marinating, bubbling away, waiting for the planets to align, and then the right things to happen to get written. You hear a lot of people talk about how they start a story and then they figure they're not good enough to write it, or they can't do it justice. And I've had a few like that I still have sitting around that are, for the most part, complete, but still are missing something. One of them is a historical fiction. And I know that eventually I'm going to get to the point where I can write it. I'm just not to the point where I can write it the right way yet. So having finished things before, and you get into that zone of writing, and you're like, oh, this is good. And it seems like it's coming from somewhere else, and you're just figuring out the story and it matches up. And then you can read it later and see even more connections that you may not have realized were in it before. And maybe in a rewrite, if you haven't published it yet, you'll put in, some connections to highlight them, or you just leave it that way and other people will tell you about it when they read it too. But the story becomes its own thing.
A good editor is a wonderful thing, TR. A good
Yeah.
editor solves much of that process that you just said. And speaking of process, you had said to me earlier that your audience in general likes discussion of creative process. And you have said a couple of things that I'd like to respond to in my experience that fall into the creative process bucket. Is that okay if I just
Sure.
take off on a little bit of a rip on a couple of things you said?
Yeah. Digress.
Okay. Probably my favorite author is Stephen Pressfield. And I don't know if you know him or have read any of his books, but he is a writer. He writes a lot of historic fiction, but he also writes some things that are not. But the things I like of Pressfield's are historic fiction. And Pressfield and I share a little history with the United States Marine Corps. And in one of Pressfield's books, he wrote a book about how to write. And I have read several people. Stephen King wrote one, other people have written them. Pressfield's is the only one that I really found valuable. And one of the things that Pressfield said in that little book he wrote on how to write is the thing that taught him more about writing than anything else in his life was the United States Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps teaches you to love misery. That's an incredible phrase, but that's what he said. And the truth of the matter is, for me, not for, I have no idea about other writers, but for me, 99% of my work is perspiration. I have only twice in my entire life had the muse come sit on my shoulder and give me dictation. And every time else, it's just saying, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, you've had your second cup of coffee, get your ass down in that chair, open the computer, put your fingers on the keyboard, and type something. And if you have to re-edit and re-edit, or if you spend the whole damn day writing it and throwing it away, doesn't matter that much, but it's 10 o'clock in the morning, get your ass in the chair and start typing. And so for me, a lot of times it's work, but you can imagine I edit heavily, I rewrite. I have an editor that I think is fabulous that really pisses me off and kills my babies a lot of times, but makes me a better writer. So for me, it's work. It's work. I love the work, but it's work.
Yeah. The Marines for me was not what I thought it would be, but I'm glad I did it. And if somebody said, do you want to do it again? And I keep the memory of it, then I probably would still do it again. But I would definitely do it again if I didn't know, if I didn't have an idea what it was. But I like the idea of it teaching you to love misery. My view is similar, that it teaches you the survival of things, where
Right.
if you can survive, then that's how you win, is you just keep surviving. And then a lot of it was just learning how to take crap from people. That's the underside of it. I mean, the war fighting side is surviving. The real world side, that's what, when you come back to the real world and they say, well, what'd you learn in the Marines that you're going to be able to use in the civilian sector? And it's just taking crap from people.
Yeah, I had a DI who put me in the hospital for 5 months, so I'm with you. I'm with you, and I don't hold it personally about what he was doing. He was just doing his job. Don't misunderstand that. I mean, his job was to drive me as hard as he could, and he drove me just a little harder than this body frame should have been driven. But I got it. I'm with you, TR. Absolutely, absolutely.
Did they have the San Diego depot back then, or was it Paris Island?
No, that's where I went to boot camp. I went to boot camp at MCRD San Diego.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was West Coast guy. But may I, and again, I mean, it's your interview, not mine, but you have told me kind of what your audience leans to. I'd like to make one more comment on my creative process, if it's appropriate, if I haven't bored you and your audience with what I've already said.
No, go for it. It's more of a conversation than an interview. So
okay,
have a conversation.
The book I wrote about the Marine Corps, and you being a Marine will understand this, but the title of the book is Non Semper Fidelis. Now that doesn't translate to never faithful. That translates to not always faithful. And the book isn't a study in power. and the use of power and how men use power. And I'm old enough that I was in during the Vietnam era. And in the story is instead entirely in stateside, TR. There's not a shot fired in anger in the whole book. That's not what it's about. There are two Marines who create essentially the same infraction. That is a fairly simple infraction. They go AWOL. And one of them is disciplined by, and I think from looking at you, you're probably quite a bit younger than I am. But if you can think about when the Marine Corps was literally trying to double its size within a year, they were pulling guys in and running through as quick as they could. And there were a lot of young men, college graduates with brown bars or silver bars on their shoulder that were not long-term Marines and simply had to drive men potentially to their death. And most of those guys were terrified of their own ability to make decisions and made decisions precisely by the book and didn't understand that power is best used when you apply it to the specifics of a situation. And the result of that is that one of these two men who went AWOL was adjudicated by a young college graduate who joined the Marine Corps, got a couple of bars on his shoulder, had obligations, and despite the absurdity, was afraid to do anything other than precisely what the book says because he was afraid he would be judged on it. The other one was handled by a career NCO, a guy that had 2 Navy crosses, a guy that had been at Pork Chop Hill in Korea. And his name was Roundtree, Top Sergeant Roundtree. Roundtree was one of those guys in the Marine Corps, and you know some of them, who was simply heroic, a bit of a legend, simply walking down the street. And Roundtree handled the other infraction. And Roundtree used it to teach the man a very important lesson, not to crush him. And when I wrote that book, I have told you that only twice in my life has the muse come to sit on my shoulder. And the first chapter of that book is very brief. And it is, I tend to be a very straight up storyteller. I tend to be quite direct in my stories. The last thing anybody would call me is a literary writer. And that first chapter is almost poetry. And I literally took dictation. She came and sat on my shoulder, and the keyboard just flew. And it doesn't read like anything else I've ever written. It's better than anything else I've ever written. And I wish I could find some way to seduce her to come back and sit on my shoulder more often, but she doesn't.
Why do you think it happened then?
That's a really good question, TR. You know, I don't know. It was mysterious. I mean, I admit that I surround myself with tools of writing to try to create the mystery. This is sitting on my desk in front of me, and it is a stick that is a Maasai stick. And when I say Maasai and you think warriors, you presume it's a club, but
Yeah,
it's not. It's a writing stick. You hold it in your hand at this end and you write in the dust with the other end. I keep that on my desk in front of me. And I, without picking up the computer and turn it around, I can't show it to you. But in front of me, I've got a statue that I bought in Mexico that was Indian art, but it's St. John. And it shows a picture of a saint writing with a quill pen. And I don't know if you're religious or not, but St. John opens, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. I'm looking at St. John writing words. I've got a Maasai writing stick in front of me. Every morning when I write, I open the first words of the Odyssey, and the first words of the Odyssey are not the poem. They are a prayer to the muse to come sit on his shoulder and make the story come out right. I try to surround myself with the mystery of that, but I don't understand it. I don't know why she came. I don't know what I can do to induce her to come.
I wonder if a world or a life of working in real estate has turned a page on your innate or child time frame of creativity where it's still there. It's just a page away of being able to connect with that. And you were just writing something that was so part of you that that's why the muse showed up and was like, hey, this is how you got to write this.
That may well be it. That may well be it. Now, I will admit, I mean, I was 35 years selling people warehouses and moving in and out in warehouses. Nothing heroic or even particularly beautiful about that. But the process didn't require much. Once you learned the process, it was just work and just going through the steps.
Right.
And I devoted my life to most of that. So maybe that's it. I mean, maybe my mind has been so cluttered by Gantt charts and process that as an old man, I have a hard time freeing up that right side of my brain to go creative. I don't know. But as you know, because it's clear you're right, it sure is marvelous when it happens.
I still think it's there. Even if, and I would have maybe felt different about this a few years ago, but I've been on a couple-year journey of poetry myself. And
okay. You that is a journey.
Yeah. I've always worried, like, this is it? Like, I'm going to do this poetry book and that's it. And I'm going to move on and back to science fiction or adventure fiction or whatever. And then because I had showed up so often and did the writing and was open to it, I think the world of poetry or wherever that comes from said, no, we're not really finished with you yet. So here's some more ideas. So
that is the muse showing up when they grab a hold of you by the collar of your shirt and say, no, you're not going anywhere, kid. That's a wonderful story.
You want to write about spaceships, but you're going to write about feelings and different worlds, and it's going to be strange, and you might not understand it when you write it, and then maybe you understand it later, or sometimes you never will. I mean, that's how I would classify the type of poetry I write. Is definitely, it's free verse for sure, but maybe that's why you're drawn to historical fiction, is because through your life, you've, as you said before, you started out and you wanted to be secure in living before you started doing the more artistic side of things, the more creative side of things.
Yeah.
Not to say that selling real estate isn't creative in its own way, but the more creative arts. And now you feel this draw in this home in historical fiction. And maybe that's the thing that's going to break loose whatever it was. And you're going to have that experience again. If you said it happened twice, so that's one time, what's the other time it happened?
The other time I was very young, and the other time, this is interesting, but it was a business memo. I made the business memo into a metaphor, and it was a metaphor of medieval war. And I was working for Johnson & Johnson, and it's not the kind of thing that they would accept, and it's even the kind of thing that they might damn. But it was so well done, and the metaphor so well put together that it became rather famous around the division I worked in Johnson & Johnson. And I was creating a medieval battle and of course the competitive firm was the other side, and the clients were the castle that had to be taken. And I was terrified to actually put it out, but I did. And it just got huge praise, and it moved me to the front of everybody's chart as this is a young man we should pay attention to. So I got away with it.
Yeah, you had the creativity then. I think that's what life does to a lot of people, is it just breaks them down so much and teaches them that stand in line and do what you're supposed to. And maybe it's productive for society, but maybe it's not so productive for art.
We pay a price, guys like you and me. And I think we probably pay it willingly because we love our country and we love our lives, and we're appreciative of the fact that we get things that nobody else in the world gets. But that doesn't mean we didn't pay the price. I mean, my right leg is an inch shorter than my left leg, and I have disability because I can't run. And I mean, I'm a healthy guy, and for a damn near 80-year-old man, I'm the fittest guy in LA. but I paid a price, and so did you.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you look back on and you start to have the aches, and you think, you wake up and your knees don't hurt. That's a good day.
Right.
You go, man, how was I this hard on my body? And you look back on it and you maybe think there's got to be other people out there that did more than I did. This seems like
They can
like
drive
I'm
us.
not as durable as I should be.
They can drive
But
us pretty hard.
yeah,
Can I say one thing about one of my books specifically instead of the creative process? There is one thing that I like to try to say about the book, and I'll transition it by saying part of the creative process is that the woman in my life is an artist, and she is an artist of enough reputation that the Smithsonian commissioned one of her murals 6 years ago. So it's not that she sits around and struggles and says, "I want to be an artist." In fact, one of the funniest conversations I ever heard was sitting with her, and we had met some people that were also invited to the same dinner. And the gentleman looked at her and said, "Rita, what do you do?" And she said, "I'm an artist." And he looked at her and said, "Good luck." And I just wanted to die laughing. She just needs luck. The whole world knows her. But being around Rita and watching her work and watching the way she thinks, being around another creative who, in her case, she's a brilliant creative, is really helpful to, I think, getting me where I want to go. And I had showed you and your audience one book. I'll show you another one, but you might notice a similarity in the art format. And that's because and here's the third one in the series. And and maybe you don't get standing right here, but you would get if I laid them all on the table in front of you, it's the same artist. Mm-hmm. And because Rita tries to cater to me, she does these for me. And this particular one, you see an Indian on the front of it. And this is the 19th century version of the 18th century version of the story, when after the French and Indian War, Americans, they weren't even Americans then, colonials came pouring down the Ohio River and took over the Northwest Territory, which is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. And it's about the fight for that territory and the fight against the natives with the settlers that came down. But one of the things that came to me, and this is just kind of the creative process, this story has been told a lot. There are any number of books about it, about that period of time and about those battles. But this is the only one I've ever seen that is entirely from the Shawnee perspective. And why, when I decided to write the story, I thought that would be interesting to write it. And it's not my intention to revile William Henry Harrison or the colonial settlers, but it's entirely from the Shawnee perspective. So, they don't come out too good. It's not my intention to beat them up. I'm just taking another point of view. And why that came to me, that it would be more interesting if I told the story from the loser's point of view than the winner's, I don't know, but it did. And it seems to have been fairly popular. It seems to have worked.
When did you decide to tell it from that perspective? After you did the research or while you were writing it?
No, it was after the research. I read, my degree was in history out of school, and I've never gotten over it. I've never got unhooked from it. And so I read a lot of historic fiction, but I read a fair amount of real live histories read by academics. And I probably read 5,000 or 6,000 pages on the Northwest Territories before I started to write. And I mean, my writing does tend to be historic, so there is a ton of research with it. But in doing the research, and again, it wasn't my intention to do that. I presumed that I would look at it from my point of view, my ancestors' point of view, the part of my family that came into that territory when the fight was still going on. But it just didn't come out that way. I mean, it just became more and more interesting to look at it from the other guy's point of view. But
did you
start that way?
Did you have journals or anything from that time that you used, or how did you glean the native perspective?
Most of it was from an historian named Alan Eckert. And Alan Eckert is one of those men that I'll never be able to do what Eckert did, but he can take family diaries and letters and make them into poetry. I mean, he takes hard facts, and when he writes them, you want to read it. It's very pretty. It's not boring. But Eckert wrote an awful lot of his stuff from journals of the time that included a lot about what the Shawnee and what the Miami and what others thought. But the other thing it came from, I did spend 2 weeks in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, which is in Springfield, Illinois, reading microfiche until my eyes wouldn't work anymore for the day. And there's a lot in there about natives.
When you're setting up your books for that, especially if it was a one big book that broken into 3, how do you use timelines for that? Do you have a big piece of paper that you do a timeline on and plug in all the things and then just overlay?
I'm going to show my age in answering your question, and you can see me grinning because it almost embarrasses me to say this. There are, as you may know, all kinds of softwares available now where you can plug in a fact. And when you plug in the fact, you can say how many different ways it wants to come out, by date, by person, by whatever event, so that when you're trying to keep track of all the historical detail, you can look it up in any way you want as it unfolds. I tried to do it. I even hired a kid from the local junior college to come in and plug it into the program. It just doesn't work for me. Mm-hmm. And there is a writer of historic fiction who writes a lot of Tudor stuff named Philippa Gregory. Probably her most famous is the other Boleyn girl. And in a piece, in an interview that I read, I didn't listen to it, I read it with Philippa Gregory. Somebody asked her that same question, and she said, in my studio, I have nothing on the walls. The walls are clean. And she said, I will put a sheet of Mylar on a 3-foot wide roll that runs around all 3 walls of my office with only the door excluded. And she said, I'll use multiple colored Sharpies and I will break it down by date. And it may be a single year. She said, the date may be 1642, or if nothing much is going on, it may be 1642 to 1650. It just depends on how much data is in there. And do it off in stripes, and then color code the information by whether it's cultural or whether it's martial, whether it's an individual person. And that's what I did. I used a massage table. I had a sheet of plywood cut to fit on top of it. And my scroll for that book is 33 feet long. I'm just an old man. I just can't do it electronically.
Well, I think what it gives you is you can see it all.
Yeah.
And it's different than knowing it's all on a flash drive and flipping through it versus looking at it all at once. I don't know if it's the visualness of people, or maybe you could put some sort of connection between visual art and writing by way of a timeline where you can see the bigger picture. But when you have that explanation of you can't see something in a stressful situation or in a situation where it's a big deal to you because you're too close to the picture, and then as time goes, it's not healing things, it's just giving you more of the picture. So it goes farther and farther away and you can see the bigger picture. So I think that's what timelines are for me.
TR, I would have not thought that until you just said it, but you just taught me something that's absolutely correct. You just spoke from my brain. It's visual. That's exactly it. You had it right on. And I'd never, that thought had never crystallized for me, but you got why I use it on a long sheet of butcher paper.
I can see in just my own work where I try to look at a story arc. I use timelines all the time. I wish I did it more when I was a kid for learning things, because I did like history when I was younger, and I wish I'd had started a timeline and just overlaid every year of learning things on that. And when I taught, law enforcement history is the subject I was teaching, but I would do a timeline of whatever 1900 to 2000 that we were talking about. And then I'd start with wars and conflicts. And there's always a war and conflict to put in somewhere. But I'd do the
Not
ones
hard to
America
find.
was, yeah, the ones America was involved in. And then you start putting in things like prohibition, when it started, when it ended, what else was going on during that time. And it gives you a connection in your mind that I hadn't had just reading a book, because you're looking at it all, and you can visualize it from that left to right, the way our culture learns it. So you're going, oh, okay, this is when this happened. But I can also do that with stories, and I've done it with my historical fiction from 1775 to 1815. And then I also overlay in that the stories, and your typical, you start with your story starting, it gets to the apex of the story, and then it goes down. And I have a few stories that overlap each other. So then I just take a different color marker or paint and do the story arc over the timeline. And now I think that's when you're crossing over from what an artist does and what a writer does, because I look at art so much differently now because of that. When somebody explains a picture to you, especially if it's an abstract one, where they say, this is what this means, this is what this means. And you go, oh, of course it does. Okay. It makes more sense. And I think that's one of the bleed overs from the writer to the artistic world. And I used sheetrock because I was worried about it bleeding through on the wall if I was using markers. But the different color pens and different things, it really helps keep it straight, especially if you're doing something with history that's already out there. The framework is there. You're not recreating it, but certainly you could do it with your own story. If you were creating a world out of it, you could do it with a timeline and a framework. But I I think that's a great way to write and a great way to organize your thoughts.
TR, I sort of said this a couple of minutes ago, but you just explained something about myself to me. I mean, you've got my process right on, and I thank you for it because I can now articulate it.
Yeah, it's it's interesting to see that you liked history in school too, because that was one of my questions I wanted to ask was, were you always interested in history, or why do you think you got drawn to the historical fiction side of things? When you're writing a historical fiction, are you going with the idea of you're just trying to tell the story of history with a little bit of flavor, or are you also going with the idea that you're trying to tell your own story, not your own story personal, but a story that you're writing, and weave it in to history to the point where somebody would look at it and say, did this really happen?
That's a great question, and you heard the big exhale before I spoke on dealing with it. This is a bizarre thing to say for a writer of fiction, but I don't have much imagination. But the world does, and the things that happen in the world are more fascinating. You write science fiction, so you can make it up out of whole cloth. I could never do that. I simply don't have that skill. And so I look at the facts and the data, little bitty pieces of data about specific people, and go, I'll be damned, they really did that. And the next thing you know, I find myself weaving it into the story. And one of the problems I have with editors, and I shouldn't say it's a problem, it's not a problem, they make me a better writer, but I tend to write so many little details that I find interesting that they end up being a distraction from the story. And my editors almost invariably say, this isn't moving the story forward, and it's interesting, but it's distracting. So for me, it's the history. If I look at it closely enough, gives me a way that people were thinking, and why did they do that, and how did they do that, that my own imagination could not create.
Yeah, when you look back at just early, maybe 18th century or so, when people didn't sleep lying flat, that they slept a lot, almost sitting up, and you go, wow, why would they do that? Because they were worried about getting pneumonia, and they didn't use forks because they didn't want to put something sharp towards their face. So they used a flat knife that was a dulled edge, and they used it kind of as a precursor of a spoon, where you see all those little tidbits that you didn't learn in school, but would have kept you interested more so. I think you have to keep some of those things in the book. I've seen some things get over edited to the point where, especially if you're doing 3 books, where somebody will say, look, each of these books has to stand on its own. So you have to, your first chapter or however long in your second book is just explaining or setting the scene that the first book set, not so much exactly like it, but in general. And then as a reader, if you're reading through all those, by the end of the beginning of the third book, you're like, man, okay, I got it. I read the first 2. Let's get on with this. I don't like the recaps. It's like watching a TV show and seeing the, previously on this over and over again. And then sometimes it gets to the point where you could tell an editor got a hold of it so much to where, and editors are great, but there can also be bad editors too, where it's gotten so over edited that it's reminding you of something that happened the page before. Like you're an idiot. Like you're not reading the story.
So you and I have the same sense. I have fired one editor. It just didn't work. He was a nice man, and he was smart, and he knew a lot about writing. He just didn't work for me. So I said, we got to have a different one. TR, did you see Boys in the Boat, or did you read Boys in the Boat? It was out just last year. It's a late 2023 movie, and it's about the 1936 scull rowing team that won the 36 Olympics, which were the ones in Germany with Hitler. Did you see that?
I haven't.
I'll tell you the reason I asked, because I promise this fits into our conversation about detail. But let's see. The word I want to use is skull, but it's my ignorance because it's not a skull. What do you call a boat where there are 8 rowers and they only row on one side? Their oar only reaches the one side and the other guy's oar reaches the other side. That's not a skull. I don't remember what the word is, but it's an Olympic event. It always has been. It's kind of a British sport. It's kind of a sport. And in America, the winners in that had always been the prestigious old East Coast schools, Yale, Columbia. Those were the schools where rich kids that grew up with that patrician sport learned it. And they were the perpetual winners. And Boys in the Boat is about a group of young men from the state of Washington who are completely not of that class. They're absolutely working class people. 2 of their stories I specifically remember. One of them grew up in a mining camp, and his mom died, and his dad took in a new woman, and the new woman didn't like the dad's kid, so when he was 14, he was thrown out to survive on his own. Another one was a kid whose folks were farmers in Washington, and during the Depression, they were going flat broke, and they gave up on the farm, moved to the city, but they couldn't afford his mouse, so they literally left him on the farm. Here, it's yours, do with it what you can. I mean, young men who had simply grown up on their own. They had no sense of group identity. And in 1936, they beat all the Yaleys and the Columbia guys. The young, independent guys who were dependent upon themselves, who didn't think group, beat the hell out of the people who traditionally won that sport and ended up going to the Olympics. And I thought, those are my people. Those are frontiersmen. Those are people who have had to show that they can take care of themselves or die. And so I used them as a metaphor in my book. My book was about the refining of the frontier. The whole theme of that trilogy is that if individuals took over and made prosperity, they did it with sharp elbows, and they were by and large Christian folks, and churches thrived, but they were used to making their own rules. And if the rules didn't work, they tended to ignore them. But after World War II, all of those towns became civilized, if you'll allow. And the slot machines went out of the local drugstore. And the Elks Club was no longer allowed to have penny ante poker games because they were gambling. And when all of those things happened, it sucked the creativity out of societies that were rule driven. Now you're hearing sort of Sam's opinion on the world. But when I was trying to put that into a story, that story of those young men from Washington who were completely different than the patricians who usually won that sport and thought groupthink as opposed to individual effort, it was the perfect metaphor. So I put it in there.
Yeah. Is that called Rowing Crew?
Crew. That's it.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the vessel is called, but it's called Rowing Crew. That's the sport.
Yeah. I think it's just that, you have to survive. So it's the more pragmatic approach to things. Like, it's not I'm going to be the best at this because that's just the way it's always been in my family. It's, I'm going to do this because there is no alternative.
Yeah.
Or the alternative's unacceptable.
Yeah. And I mean, I admit it. I do admit that my worldview comes from my own life. And that was the story of my life. If I was indeed going to be able to live a life where I could have the luxury to find myself in a spot where I'm having this conversation with TR on Hump Day, I had to take care of myself. And so that tends to be my worldview. I admit it. It's not particularly intellectual. It was just the story of my life.
How did you, once you started writing your books, how'd you do the publishing and marketing of them?
Oh, you're a writer, so this is a complex answer. The first book that I wrote, it's called Alpha Male, A Tale of the Battle of Commerce. It's about a real estate hustle set in the 80s in Los Angeles. And it's not only a pretty good story, it still sold more copies than any other book I've ever written. And it sold more copies because every commercial real estate guy in America has met it. I have met any number of people at a meeting where I don't know people that have a name tag on and walk straight up to me and stick their hand out and say, I loved your book. But it never broke out of the commercial real estate market. I mean, I think in retrospect, my flaw was I didn't explain the hustle well enough that if you weren't already among the initiated, you didn't understand it. That issue, that style got me to send that book to a bunch of publishers because I thought to get a book published, you had to get an agent. So I sent it off to a bunch of agents and had, just like you and every other writer, I got an inch-high stack of sheets of paper rejecting it. But one guy who was a New York agent broke my heart, but he educated me. And when he wrote me the letter back, it was clear he'd read the story. It was clear he liked the story. And I thought, whoopee, I'm about to get an agent. And then he said, but understand, the way I get paid is 15% of whatever advance you get. And my 15% of an advance that I can get you for this book is not worth taking two guys to lunch to try to sell it to them. Good luck. And so then I started sending it to second and third rate houses where I didn't need an agent. And an outfit named Daniel and Daniel picked it up and published it. John and Susan Daniel, man and wife. And I remember the first conversation I had with John Daniel when he called me back from the letter. He said, listen, Susan and I make our living doing self-help books and cookbooks. He said, but we're like everybody in this business. What we really like is stories. And we have a little imprint called Fithian that publishes only 4 or 5 novels a year, but that's what we like to do. And we'd like to publish your book, but understand, Sam, Fithian doesn't make any money. And if you publish with us, you probably won't either. He was that direct. but he picked me up when nobody else would. And in fact, I did make a little money, but mostly because it sold a lot of books. And then they also published my second book. And then John died in their little house, and Susan didn't want to run it without him, and she closed it down. So I asked if I could have legal complete authority for my books back, if I could have them back. And she said, sure. So I start to write the trilogy, and I get introduced to a guy named Charlie Newton. And Charlie Newton's a man who has written 11 novels that sell reasonably well. And Charlie Newton set me down. He did this as a favor to a friend. And he said, look, Sam, he said, the publishing business has changed totally in the last 20 years. And he said, it's become very much like the music business. He said, the music business can no longer afford to nurture an artist through Motown. He said, everybody can publish their own music now. The software is out there, and the world is full of one-hit wonders because there's not a publishing house in America that can afford to nurture Smokey Robinson for 15 years before he finally gets a record. And he said, the publishing is the same way. He said, Amazon takes a 35% scrape off the top, and they sell half the books in America. So he said, think of it like a businessman. They've just sucked 17% out of the total marketplace, which means that the publishing houses don't have the money to nurture you or anybody else. And he said, on top of that, there are 4,500 books a day copywritten in America. And he said, I finally, on my 7th novel, had the same agent that Dan Brown had when he published the Da Vinci Code. And he got me a contract with one of the biggest houses in New York. And I thought, whoopee, I'd made it. And when I got there, I found out there was no there there. They were just going to shove my book out. And if it sold, it sold. And if it didn't, tough. And he said, so there's no reason to try to use that process. There's no reason to do it. So my last 3 books have been published by Agave Americana Books. And in this interview, I make no bones about it. I made a little money in the real estate business. If I was going to self-publish, I was going to start my own publishing house. And so I did. Agave Americana is me. It's effectively self-published, but I put this firm together to do it. And if you don't know them, and I don't mind touting these folks at all, but there is a group in Seattle called Girl Friday Productions. And you can imagine that Girl Friday is all run by middle-aged women because there's no young woman in America who would name her firm Girl Friday. And these women, I have got, and I'll bet you've got something like it too, TR, but I have got a Gantt chart that is single-spaced lines, 2.5 pages long, of every step between a finished manuscript and books in a bookstore. And Girl Friday has a very interesting model. They are all women out of the publishing business who know the publishing business from beginning to end. They just set up their own house. And Girl Friday effectively does production. And Girl Friday wants to know 2 things. They want to know how many words your manuscript is, and which one of these services on the 2.5 pages of items between here and there you're willing to pay for. And they price it, and they do brilliant professional work. And the creative has their own control, but it ain't cheap. It's not like going to Amazon and having KDP simply print your author and print your book and put it out. So I've had a little of both experiences. I've had a little of publishing house, and I've had a little of self-publishing.
What about on the marketing end of it? What do you do for that?
That's tough. I mean, that's really tough. I haven't got the answer to that, and I have done everything. I've run book tours over the states of Indiana and Illinois because that's where it was all, as I said, it was Northwest Territories. And I die laughing. I've lived on the West Coast most of my life, and when I say Northwest Territory to my friends, they all think I'm talking about Washington and Oregon. And no, that's not what the Northwest Territory Act is about. And I've done book tours around. I try when I can and appreciate being invited to you to talk to any audience that is. Barnes and Noble has been pretty good to me. They're pretty quick and pretty easy to deal with. I've done targeted advertising. I have given away books through Goodreads to try to encourage people to do it. I've done all of those things. And TR, I haven't found the key. I mean, it's not that none of them work. It's not that they don't sell any books, but I spend more money marketing than I make on selling books. So I'm doing something wrong there. I'm just not getting it right.
Yeah, I would imagine that's what most writers go through.
Yeah. But again, I mean, there are 4,500 books a day. And frankly, I don't know if that's a 5-day week or a 7-day week that apply to the Library of Congress or a Library of Congress number for their book. I mean, it's just so much material.
Yeah.
And
I always wondered where my books go when I send them to the Library of Congress.
Did you ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? They're in that same case, in that same
it's
word.
Next to the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. Every time I send one, I think there's no way that anybody's opening this. Yeah, go ahead.
You've got a novel that you said, I think you said 1785 to 1815.
Yep.
Can I have the name of it? I'd like to read it.
Oh, that's the one that I'm still writing, that I have.
Okay.
1775 to 1815. It's called Freedom.
When you get it done, put me on your list. Okay. You've got my email. Put me on your list. I'd love to read it, TR. I would.
Yeah. I've started that probably 10 years ago, and I've got it just about complete. I mean, you could put it out now, but it's just not what it should be. So I was set it aside to do some other things, got wrapped up in this poetry thing for a couple of years. And then I need to go back and see if I'm any better at explaining what I'm trying to explain in it. So
TR, may I ask what part of the world it's set in?
Yeah, it goes from the Guinea area of Africa to South America, Brazil type place, up through Central America, through the lower Louisiana now time frame, or the Louisiana area now, south of the United States. And it follows a guy that's sold into slavery in the year 1775, and then just what goes on after that. So I would call it more of a adventure historical fiction, but there's a lot of stuff about sailing and read a bunch of books on Africa and all of that, read a bunch of things on Central America and South America, and then the beginning of the US back then. So it's a lot of things that I wish I'd have learned about in school. I don't know if you have the ability to learn all of world history. I mean, I know you don't have the ability to learn all of world history when you're just going through, first grade through high school, but I think even if I put it out and it amounts to nothing, it was still worth it during the research and learning all that just for myself. So
I agree with you completely. I do not depend on my book sales to live, and I love the work. I do. It gives me purpose, TR, and I like doing it. But I would like to read that story. And part of what I was thinking when you were saying that, my favorite movie of all time is The Mission. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's about the papal bull that cut the line through the world and said this part's Spain and this part's Portugal. Mm. And so Brazil got cut off and had originally been Spanish. And it's about the transition from when it went to Spanish to Portuguese, and very much about the slave trade, about the difference in the Spanish view to the Portuguese view on the slave trade.
Yeah, it's really something reading about all that. And then I'm sure you do the same thing where a lot of it is research, but a lot of it is just sitting there thinking, like considering all these different perspectives and how you would have felt if you were alive at that point, what was going on then, how that affects other things. A lot of looking at timelines of this was going on in this part of the world, this was going on in this. And I don't know if you can put modern sensibilities to people back then. I think when I think about that, I think about 100 years from now, what are people going to think about what we were doing and what we're thinking? Yeah. It's going to be different. And you can see it just in our lifetime of how people have, just in the US, of how the ideas of things have changed just in that little bit of time. So it's something.
I think we see the world the same way. I remember when statues started to come down, that one of my friends, and I don't think this is her line, I think she picked it up somewhere else, but she said, we have to judge people in their own time. And I think that's just what you said, that it's hard for me as a 20th and 21st century American to look back on the way people behaved in 16th century Italy and not judge it by my standard. But you and I have learned to try to do that, at least try.
Yeah, I think even if you went to different parts of the world now, you would find that how we think about things is different than how other people think about things. That's one of the things I liked about the military, was you got to see parts of the world that you might not have normally seen. And true, it was in a situation where you probably couldn't recognize or have time to look at the beauty of it because you were there for whatever reason you were there for. And you do see how different cultures, they don't understand things how you understand them. You don't understand them how they understand them. You can get a little bit of that if you just go on vacation to somewhere different, but
yeah,
it's
not
when you start thinking about it, it's really something.
TR, did you read The Things They Carried, which was one of the few books written about Vietnam by a Marine and in the time period? I mean, I didn't know what it meant when I did it, but he clearly did. And it's a beautiful, beautiful rendition of the way soldiers in Vietnam saw it and tried to see it, if you've not read it.
I think I did. I think it was one of those things they make you read in boot camp. Like they tell you, these are the books you're going to be
on the
reading.
commandant's list. I sent my book to the officer in charge of the commandant's list, and I knew he was going to say no, and he did. I thought it was sold a few books and been great fun to have a book titled "Not Always Faithful" on the commandant's list, but I knew he wasn't.
Yeah. So. Well, I mean, Rifleman Dodd's up there, but yeah, I think I've read that a while ago.
Yeah.
It's, what did you do in the Marines? This is what, when you get two Marines together, that's what they have to talk about after some boot camp stories and where you went. And I call you a Hollywood Marine, and we go through that.
And that's true. MCRD San Diego did not live up to the expectations of the guys from the East Coast. I went to OCS. I went to boot camp. The complexities of the draft issues then are not relevant, but I went to boot camp at MCRD San Diego and then ended up at OCS in Quantico.
Yeah.
And at OCS in Quantico, I sort of teased at first that I had a TI that drove me to 5 months in a hospital, but it was a very interesting exercise. Very interesting. We did it in platoon-sized groups. And the first thing you did was complete the obstacle course. You didn't do that for any time. They weren't rushing on the obstacle course. We even had one really weak sister that we all liked in our platoon, and we helped him over the obstacle course. At the end of the obstacle course, when the whole platoon is gathered, we ran the hill trail. And the hill trail at Quantico is a famous 3-mile meandering up through the hills, up and down through the hills. And you start off at one end of the grinder, and after the 3 miles, you end up clear at the other end of the grinder. And the exercise, and we were clearly told that the exercise was leaderless. There was a DI along, and he was interestingly not a man who had been assigned to us before. It was the first we met him for that exercise. And I'm pretty sure it was the first assignment he ever had as a drill instructor. But the exercise was supposed to be leaderless, and it was. But if you didn't finish with the leader of your platoon, you were not given any credit for the run, and you would get shit for not having finished the run. We had the weak sister, And the weak sister was a guy whose father and grandfather had been Prussian generals. He spoke about 6 languages. He was smart as a whip, and he was the skinniest little piece of shit that ever went through boot camp. And we just had to help him. And we knew all he wanted was to go into intelligence, that he had this huge geopolitical background. He had this huge language background. He was going to get brown bars on his shoulder, and he was going to go into intelligence, and he didn't need to be a great trigger puller. So the other guy at the other end of the platoon was a guy who had come the previous year third. He ran for the University of Oregon, and he had come third in cross countries US in his senior year. Bluma could run really fast for a really long time. And so we start up the hill trail, and we're literally carrying some of the weak sisters' gear. It's leaderless. You can do what you want. It's not formation. And we're trying to help the kid along. And the DI quickly figured out what was going on. And he went up to Bluma, who was running in this pack at the front of the pack. And he started to get in his head. And he's going, Bluma, you can set a record here. Bluma, you can do this faster than it's ever been done. Next thing you know, we're catching glimpses of the platoon in front of us through the trees, and he's saying, Bluma, nobody's ever caught the platoon in front of him, ever. And Bluma was not a bad guy, but he got into his head. I mean, he was working his weak spot. He was working what he was proud of and he could do. And Bluma got going so fast, there were a couple of us who might have been able to keep up. I had been a competitive swimmer in college. I was in pretty good shape. I wasn't a runner, but I was in pretty good shape. And we were trying to slow him down. We were screaming at him, we're going to lose weak sister out the back. Don't do this. There's no reason. And I remember having a bit of a kerfuffle with the DI who told me that I shouldn't be trying to slow him down. And I said, of course, Corporal. I thought the exercise was leaderless, but if you tell me it's not, I'll shut up. And of course, he couldn't say anything about that because it was a leaderless exercise. And so we were literally carrying this guy's gear. Somebody had his pack, somebody had his rifle. I'm up in Bluma's ear as constantly as I can. And we come down off the bottom of the hill trail. And we can see the grinder in front of us. And all we got to do is cross 200 yards of grinder and we're through. But Bluma could see the platoon in front of him, about 50 yards in front of us, and only 200 yards to go. And Bluma just couldn't be held in check. He couldn't. And literally, he was going to cross as a record setter, but a platoon of 1. And I remember screaming at him, the manual says to get there as quick as you can in condition to fight, Bluma. And he's just screaming. And I dove at him to literally I'd tackle him. I didn't, but I dove at him. But I took 2 steps on the grinder and my femur snapped. And it was really interesting that the doc said, the orthopedic surgeon said, I would not have believed it was possible to stress fracture a femur, but you're the 3rd Marine I've seen do it. And so I ended up 5 months in the hospital trying to get hit back together. And then after the 5 months in the hospital, I was another 3 months getting back on full duty in simply a reconstruction platoon. And they of course wanted me to go back through OCS. And this was, and you're a Marine, TR, you'll get this. But I had the right to refuse those orders. And the contract with which I had signed the Marine Corps was 3 years from date of commissioning or 2 years from the date of enlistment. And so when I got back on full duty and I went in to see the colonel to get my orders, it was the hardest thing I ever had to do. And when I say hard, I mean, I was scared to death. I knew it was legally I could do it. But to stand in front of that man and refuse those orders was just, it was humiliating. I'd had it. I'm not much of a Marine. I wasn't going to do much anymore. So I never, the whole time, I literally, and if you weren't in Vietnam, you won't remember this, but it took 15 months to have a tour. The tour was 13 months, but it was a month going over and a month coming back. And And the week I got out of the hospital, I rolled 15 months. And so that was it. I was short-term duty the rest of the time. So I have no heroic Marine Corps Vietnam stories to tell at all. None.
It's a good story, though. It's a great lesson for combat, especially when you take into account like the Chosin Reservoir, where as the story goes, the Army was retreating and they weren't together. And then when the Marines were fighting their way in a different direction, as they say, a lot of them survived more so than if you just take off a dash through the woods on your own. And I wonder if it's got to be a thing that drill instructors are taught to try to, through many different devices, get the leaders of the platoon to teach them a lesson of watching out for everyone, and also teaching everyone else the importance of keeping up.
You know, that's funny you say that. We're thinking the same way, but in the course of my life, I have often wondered if Bluma learned that lesson. If my failure as a pretty fit Marine candidate ever had the impact on him that he was better at things than almost anybody else in the world, and he could push people without pushing them to the breaking point. I've often wondered if Bluma learned from that experience. I hoped he did. I mean, I have no particular animus to him. We were all young, and
you're in those positions and you're finding out what you're made of. I mean, that's the whole purpose of that training. I think everybody, I mean, that's a good story that illustrates it well. And I think if you talk to most people, they have some sort of story where that has unfolded in a similar way. Where I've had one in training where we were released from PT and then one of our guys passed out because it was too cold. He passed out if it was too cold or too hot, and we knew it. So 4 of our guys take him to the hospital on the base. We're in Fort Leonard Wood. And then all the cattle cars that we normally got in to go back to the barracks to before the next thing we were supposed to do, they were all gone. So we were the only ones out there after a battalion PT. So it was only a mile or so, probably not even that. I don't know, maybe a mile or 2 back to the barracks. And it was just our platoon. So I was like, all right, we're going to go back in formation. We go in formation everywhere. We just ran in formation. We're going to jog back in formation. We're not going to try to kill each other. You know, we're not going to sprint or anything. We're just going to get back there. We're going to post road guards, do all the stuff we're supposed to do. And it worked for about the first few 100 yards. But then when you have a bunch of people that are in training that don't have the drill instructor yelling at them, and even at this was after boot camp. So this is during the A school, and had about 15 or 20 people out of 70 that just broke off and started doing their own thing, running their own direction they wanted to go. And we ended up with maybe 30 out of a 70-person platoon back together. And that was the lesson for me, was how do you keep people together? And then how do you get them to learn from this so this doesn't happen in combat? Like, you can't just do your own thing. I mean, you might end up dying, and we might all end up dying, but we are going to do it together.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And those are hard lessons, because we all want to look out to our own salvation. It's a hard lesson to learn. And Tilly, when you told that story about Chosin, I mean, I think the reason I joined the Marine Corps instead of simply being drafted was that when I was a kid, I absolutely remember pictures coming out of Korea where there are Jeeps backing out in the frozen and dead Marines strapped on their fenders like a deer they had been hunting, because we're not leaving you behind.
Yeah. It becomes your reason for not just getting back, but you also have to get back with the bodies or the injured, that now that's who you're responsible for. It becomes less about the combat and more about, as they always say in the books and the movies, that it's about the person next to you. So it's.
And I also admit that one of my favorite quotes of all time about character is from Chesty Puller, that famous quote when he got surrounded by the Chinese and he wouldn't show any distress. His communication was, we're making contact with the enemy on all four sides.
Yeah.
It's like, we got him right where we want him.
Yeah. It's
tough guys. Tough guys.
Yeah. And to think about what has to lead up to have that opportunity, to have the right person with the right opportunity, that a lot of the military is just it's place and time that you may not get the chance to do something like that, or you may get the chance to do it and then find out that you're not the one that's going to be able to do it. So I think that's what makes the military stories compelling, because people don't know what they're going to be able to do until they're confronted with it. So they're trying to live that through those books.
Yeah, because there's nothing in my life. I mean, I suppose if I had been born in Eastern Europe or something, there may have as a young man, but there was nothing in my life that I was going to say prepared, but I suppose there are experiences that tend to prepare you for it, but there was nothing in my life, anything like that, anything like they were going to show me in North Korea or Vietnam. I had to be trained to that. There's no way with my mindset that I'm going to live through that without somebody pounding it into my little pea brain.
Yeah. The best advice I got before boot camp was, no matter how much you think you're ready, you're never ready.
Yeah.
It's the best. Do you think that selected service, that every citizen should have to register for that or put in a time of service in the military?
I'm a bit of a flag waver. And I'm looking at one over your shoulder. And I think we all owe a great deal to America. Some are asked more than others because of their circumstances and the time. That marvelous Abraham Lincoln quote, all gave some gave all. I think that we should all have some sort of national service. And my preference would be military training, but if it's just something like the old-fashioned Peace Corps, but somewhere where you've got to spend a couple of years in your life serving your nation, I would be content with that. My mentality wouldn't be that everybody has to do what you and I did, but everybody should do something.
Yeah, some sort of service to the country. I agree.
Yeah.
Whether it doesn't have to be combat.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now you're working on your 7th book, you said?
Sixth.
Okay.
And I'd love to tell you about it because I'm fascinated. I have no idea how much time we've got. I don't know how long our interview is, but I'd love to chat about it if you're willing.
Let's go. Let's do it.
Okay. I absolutely fell in love with a 16th century Italian woman named Maria Silviati. And it was one of those files that I told you early on that I simply keep a file and I'm going to get around to it eventually. And when I started doing the research on her, I ended up discovering that even though it started with Maria Silviati, that there are 3 generations of the same family, women, not men. In 2 of the generations, they married into the family, but 3 women in the same family over 3 generations, starting in the 16th century and running into the 17th century. No, other way around, starting in the 15th century and running into the 16th century.
Okay.
That are each one more incredible than the next. And they're real. It's like I said about me in historic fiction. I can't make this stuff up. These women are incredibly real. And so I have written a story called Thy Mother is a Lioness. And it is about a young woman who would be in the 4th generation, sort of learning at her mother's knee. She starts out bitching that she's just a woman and she will never amount to anything because she's only a woman and only men have power and wealth in the world. And her mother, who was one of the most famous, difficult, dynamic, controlling women in the history of the world, a woman named Catherine de' Medici, who was Queen Regent of France for 10 years, is trying to explain to this little girl by telling these stories about her ancestors, how tough it can be and how tough women rise to it. And I've just had more fun writing it than you can imagine. The story is not only about women, it's in a woman's voice because a woman is telling her child about her ancestors. And I tried to read, I did read Life of a Geisha to try to have some understanding of what a woman's voice is like. I don't think I've made it, but it's a story by women about women, and that is a complete divergence for me.
I wonder how much of a queen's life is like a woman versus like a man's. Like, it seems like back being a monarch that there were certain ways you had to keep power. And I don't think that would matter if you were a man or a woman. You just have to keep power a certain way. So I wonder if, did you find that
she was not only tough as nails, Catherine de' Medici I'm talking about now, but my reading of her makes her ruthless. And that is not to say vicious. That is not to say that she was not a decent human being, but she did exactly what you said, TR. She did what she had to do when she had to do it, and she didn't matter who got crushed in the way. Her obligation was to France. And so I'm with you on that. Catherine de' Medici, however, is really interesting in that most of her life she was completely powerless, except that she had been around power her whole life and watched it used. But she was married. Her uncle was a pope, and he used her as a political tool, which she had known her whole life what she was. She knew her place. And he married her to one of the King of France's sons, but not the Dauphin. And then damned after she got married to this kid, she was 14 and the kid she got married to was 16 or something like that. But after she got married to him, his brother died of all things, an ear infection. And so now he suddenly becomes the Dauphin. And Catherine de' Medici had lots of kids. She had 10 of them. They didn't all live, but she had 10 of them. 3 of them were kings of France. One of them became Queen of France. One of them became Queen of Spain. And one of them that is not a relative, but she raised, was Mary Stuart, who became Queen of Scotland. She was raised in the French court. And she taught all of these people how to govern, including the women. And she had her first son, who was king, died very young of some sort of disease. And her second son, who was king, was only 10 years old. So she became Queen Regent of France until he turned 18. So for 8 years, she ran France. And the thing that she did that was probably most interesting was both Germany and Britain had been absolutely torn apart by the Reformation and the wars between Protestants and Catholics. And she was bound and determined not to let that happen to France. And she didn't succeed. And one of the things she had done to try to succeed was marry her daughter to a young man who was going to be the king of Navarre. And Navarre was the only kingdom in Europe that was openly Protestant. And so she married these two in an attempt to make France settle down and have power given to both sides. And quite literally, the week of their marriage was the week of the St. Bartholomew's massacre, when 30,000 Protestants were killed in France. And Catherine de' Medici immediately realized that France was going to war, that she had not been successful at keeping out of war with herself. And she dropped that little girl like a hot potato and said, "We're Catholic, you're done." So she was ruthless, and she taught how. She taught how.
Yeah, I think one of the things of looking at history teaches you is sometimes the good old days weren't the good old days.
Right, exactly. I'm with you entirely. I'm with you entirely. But I'm really looking forward to that. And you and I were talking about editing earlier. There is one Medici who was a warrior, and we think of the Medicis as politicians and money men. But one of the sons was not only a warrior, he was considered the best warrior in Italy. And he ran a private army, a Condottieri army. He'd originally started out working for the Pope, who was his uncle. And then eventually he simply formed his own, paid for it himself, and rented it out mostly to the Pope, but it was his. And part of the reason he was so damn good was that he saw war in a more modern way than the more traditional ways. He did a bunch of things that to guys like you and me are fairly simple, but plate armor went out with harbuskers when they could penetrate it. The problem with harbuskers was you had to put it up on a monopod and light a handlet and fuse and let the fuse roll up while you fired. And meanwhile, you've got guys on horses charging you at the gallop. And who knows if you can keep them in your sights, and who knows if they're going to get here before you fire. And what Giovanni de' Medici did, this was just fabulous. But he put 2 levels of pikemen at the front of his troops. And so now we're more like the Spartans, where we've got all these points going straight up. And as I suspect you probably know, a horse, no matter how well trained, will not go through an army of pike. I mean, it was why the British formed in squares when they were charged by cavalry. So a horse won't do it if everybody holds place. They just won't.
A mousetrap. Yeah. I think Alexander the Great came up with that or something.
And he would hold them with the pikes, and then the harbuskers worked just fine. You're aiming at a standstill target and you've got plenty of time. And he was blowing these plate armor guys just away. And so, he figured out some other things. Like he had a thought that, how is it that the French have invaded Naples and they took Naples and more people died after they took it than before? And he came to the conclusion that they were bringing disease with them. So it had to be shit. And he was one of the first people to absolutely insist that you wouldn't let a horse pee or poop upstream, and that if anybody pooped and not on a train, they'd get whipped. And he trained them into, you're going to use what you and I would consider more conventional hygiene. So his guys didn't buy. He didn't let them live off the land. He paid for their food. And his theory wasn't that he was more gentle. His theory was that I'm not going to have my men depending on anybody but me, number one. And number two, I'm not going to have them break formation to go steal chickens so they can eat dinner. Okay. So he did just things that to you and I would seem simple, but nobody else was doing them. So he's in there, and I'm writing the military history of what I just told you about. I'm writing that in. And the editor, bless her heart, she's a woman, and she said, Sam, she said, I love military history because we talked about it, but this stuff is not relevant to the story. You've got to trim it out. Oh, well, I liked writing it. It was great fun.
You just needed to do a second edition, like the history edition.
Yeah, maybe I would. So
the logistics, that's what wins. Logistics. Yeah. And with the Romans, they said I can't remember the name of what their pickaxe was, but that won more wars than anything else, is just being able to do earthworks.
Yeah, I believe, I'm not sure I'm right because I haven't read that much history on it, but Roman armies in general would make 15 miles a day. And the reason they'd make 15 is because every night they dug trenches and put sharpened trees and stuff in the trenches. They never camped in the open. I believe that's correct, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, between that and then making the roads everywhere they went. So.
They could go fast.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you look at road design these days and how much is taken from the road design of the Romans as far as what we consider the highway, what we consider the roadway, and how far we go on either side of it. And even down to
the arch in the middle, the drainage along the sides. Yeah.
Yeah. Even down to the railroads using chariot width for their rails.
Yeah. I mean, I believe rail cars to this day are 2 horses ass wide. I mean, I think we're stuck with that metric, right?
Yeah. It's something. I mean, I think in World War I or II, maybe it's the beginning of World War II or between 1 and 2, that Poland changed the gauge of their rail to make it so Russia couldn't just use their train right into their country. I think they had to change the trucks, the metal wheels on the bottoms before you could continue on.
TR, I have lived that. 6 years ago, my daughter and I did something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to circumnavigate, and I've traveled a lot, but you turn around and go back home the same direction you came. But she and I flew from LA to Beijing, and then got on a train and took the train to St. Petersburg, and then flew back to New York, and then flew back to LA. So I can actually say I've circumnavigated. But when we went through the rail coming out of China and then through Mongolia, it was no problem. It was the same car. And we got to the Russian border, and they literally picked the rail without us moving out of the car. They picked it up off of the chassis and moved it onto a new chassis which fit Russian rail gauges.
Yeah.
They're still doing it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, man, how come I didn't learn that when I was in 3rd grade? You know, what would that have done for my creativity, knowing all these little tidbits of history? I mean, it would have made me more interested, but also what would have done?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, do you have a daily goal when you write? Like, do you say, I'm going to do this many words or this much time or finish this chapter, or how do you do that?
TR, it's about time with me. It's an odd thing to me, and I don't understand the biochemistry of it, but something's going on in my brain. I get as tired with brain exercise as I do with physical exercise. And I don't quite get it, but I understand you're burning a lot of calories on brain power too. But I am good in most days, unless I really get into it and the words are just sort of flowing out. I'm tired after about 3 hours, and I find myself now working to achieve the goal, to get to the end of the chapter, to get to whatever, and I'm not writing well. So generally, I lose my creative juice at 3.5 hours. So when that happens, I usually stop. But it's not words. It's not like guys who say I'm gonna get off 1,000 words today. With me, it's time.
Do you have a time frame that you're trying to finish the one you're working on now?
Yeah, I do. The edits that I've done, and I have been doing those edits since the 2nd week in January, and the goal is to have them done by the 1st week in March. So I'm getting close to the end of the edits. And Tiara, I am doing something. I'm attempting to do something I've never done before. But the book with I'll show it to you again. This one, the title of which is A Panther Crosses Over. A Panther Crosses Over is the English translation of the well-known name Tecumseh. But that's what Tecumseh translated to. And I have decided, and actually somebody suggested it to me. The comment was, Panther would make a beautiful movie. Not a good movie. The phrase was beautiful. And, I don't know if you ever saw The Last of Mohicans, which is 30 years ago now. But I mean, those kinds of scenes do make for beauty. If you've got Ridley Scott shooting a movie like that, it looks gorgeous, whether it's worth a crap or not.
Yeah.
And that was the phrase. It would make a beautiful. And I'd never thought about writing script. I think of myself as a writer of words. But I have now gone to UCLA Extension, and I'm taking my second script writing class. And my instructor in the first class, TR, said something that it turns out he's right about, but it really surprised me. Because I said, when he was asking for class introductions, that I was a writer, that I had a half a dozen books, but I had never tried to write a script, and this was my first attempt at it. And he said to me, he said, you know, being a writer is a disadvantage in writing script. He said, it's a habit you have to overcome. And I sort of looked at him cockeyed and said, what? And he said, a movie is a story told in pictures, and you are used to telling a story in words. And he's right. It's a bitch. I want to write long monologues of dialogue, long scenic descriptions, but I am trying to write Panther with script, and I sort of wanted to get started on that. And I think different creative souls run different ways, but I can't do two projects at once. I'm sort of like a woman. I got to be committed to it, or I can't do it at all.
What I found with script writing is read some scripts of things you like, so you can kind of osmosis the form and the idea of it, and then work on something that you get to write as many words as you want. And then when you're finished with that for the day, work on your script for a few minutes, because it's you know, what do they say? The script is a minute per page.
Yeah.
And you have a certain amount of time that it's going to be so much shorter than you're used to. Like when I look at movies or TV shows where they talk about, I've read 3 scripts yesterday. I'm like, how'd you read 3 books yesterday? And then you go, oh, it's not a book. It's more like instructions.
110 pages and not a lot of words on the page.
Yeah. Instructions to the director, suggestions for the actors.
Yeah. And TR, one of the things I couldn't understand when I bought Final Draft, because I'm not going to try to format this stuff myself. And I could not understand why the dialogue section in Final Draft is only like 2.5 or 3 inches long, doesn't run across the page. And one of the instructors that I had, a guy who's been around for a long time, he's got grayer hair than I do, at least he's got hair. And he said, because Hollywood has learned that if you narrow it to that, it's about a minute a page without thinking too hard. And that's why we've narrowed it that way. Exactly what you said, about a minute a page.
Yeah. I got into trying to do the script writing after I thought, how hard could it be? It is totally different, but it is, I think easier is the wrong word, because it can be difficult, but I find it easier, or it takes up less time anyway, than writing prose or a novel, because it's just exterior, night, parking lot. This guy says this guy says that, next.
Right. And I, of course, don't want to do that. I want to talk about the shadow thrown by the moon, and it's just,
you can throw that suggestion in there to the director. Like I picture the shadow of the moon across the heat of the parking lot. Okay. That's it. And then the director may or may not do that. So it gives me a little more insight into the job of a director and the job of an actor, to where it really does matter who you get to be the actor and who you get to be the director. You're going to get a totally different feel, because they're not going off of the concreteness of a book. They're going off of these stereo instructions.
Yeah. Could I ask you a question about your craft, TR? Have you ever managed to sell a script?
I have not.
Because my question is a question you ask me too, is do you have an agent? How you do the selling process? And I don't know if it's possible when you write a script just to send it out to production houses without an agent or not. I have no idea.
From what I gather, most of the time people won't talk to you about a script unless you have it copywritten, because they don't want to get into a court battle later on of you saying they stole my idea. So they don't even want to look at it. They don't want to email about it. They don't want a treatment about it. They don't want anything unless it's already copywritten. So what I do is I do it like I do a book. I just write a script and then I publish it. You can use KDP or whatever, send it to the Library of Congress, do all that copywriting stuff you normally do. And I think you're going to have that before you have a serious movie house look at it. Now, if it's just a friend you have that that makes movies or shows, maybe that's different. Or if you think you're going to do it yourself, I would say just do it yourself. Make a concept reel of it. So you have it written, you have it copywritten, however you're doing that. Do it the way that's legal. And then you make your little reel of it and send it off.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's just I don't know. I'm just a new creative craft for me, just a way to approach it. And I admit what I have tried so far, I find a little frustrating because my instructor was absolutely right. The skills that I have are not necessarily the skills that apply to a script.
Yeah. It's going to come into the connections, I think, too, of people There's so many scripts out there and so many directors that write their own script. Like you're not going to get like what's it? M. Night Shyamalan writes most of his own stuff, and then who's the guy that did Kill Bill?
Oh, Tarantino.
Yeah, Tarantino is going to do his own things. So, but there's some great videos of Tarantino talking about that world of script writing and making movies on YouTube that are worth looking at.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I appreciate that clue. I'll go look. Yeah. I'll go look. I mean, I know I live in a neighborhood where Tarantino ran a local back when you would go rent DVDs and plug them in at home. And Tarantino had a local shop here that it's no longer, that whole business has changed and doesn't exist, but people like to point out that's where Tarantino used to work doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I like his views on directing and writing because he writes novels too. So he's doing all that stuff.
I'll go look. Again, I appreciate that tip. That's the second good tip you've given me. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then the other thing would be just make it yourself. Just do some scenes yourself, shoot it yourself, do the concept of it, or plug it into an AI generator and do a storyboard for it. If you don't know anybody, well, you know somebody that can draw it. So you just got to get her to draw it. But do a storyboard, and then you can capture people's ideas or capture their attention better, I think, with those. And it shows you're serious about it. If you've already have it, it's done, copywritten, they can change it if they want. You're looking to sell the script or to option it to where they can make it. But I wouldn't do a forever option. I would do a limited, like 5 years, and then you get it back type of thing. So if they don't do anything,
boy, that must be frustrating to take a small option fee and twiddle your fingers for 5 years and yeah.
And then I often think that what would be a great business to start is one where you identify people that want to invest in filmmaking, whether it's TV shows or movies or whatever, because I've talked to a lot of filmmakers, and that's, I think, the biggest thing is trying to get the money to make their vision. So if you can find a way to get investors, that's going to help. One of
my, I've only had 2 instructors on this, but one of them said to get it sold, there are 3 elements. 1 is the script, 2 is the money, and 3 is the actor or actress, the talent. And he said, you got to get 2 of the 3. He said, if you get a major actor to say he's interested in that part and you get the script, you'll find the money. If you got the money and you got a script, you'll find it. But he said, you got to line up 2 of the 3. That was his take on it.
Yeah. I like those things where you have the 2, I mean, get 3 and that's good, but I like those. There must be a name for what that is, but it's like saying, what can you do to be successful at work? There's three things you have to do. Two of them, you're going to be successful. If you get three, that's great. But you have to have at least two. And that is show up, people like you, you're good at what you do. Any two of those, you're going to be okay.
If you can do all three, you're in good shape.
Yeah, I like those. All right, here's a historical fiction question for you. May take a little deliberation. You're going to have a meal with 5 people, alive or dead, and language is not an issue. So everybody can understand everyone else. Who goes to that meal with you?
Socrates, Jesus Christ, Julius Caesar, Abraham Lincoln, and I'll invite you along as the 5th TR, and we can sit in together.
Oh, I appreciate that. I don't want you to waste such a location on that, but I agree with the Jesus one. That's why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you have Jesus first? And then I struggle between: do you want the people that we think are famous, or do you want regular people of that time that maybe had some insight and could be able to tell you what it was like then? But
I'm okay with that, but I don't know how I'd pick them. That is to say, I don't know who that person is, but I can
just a
come up
stone
with
cutter.
historic names. Yeah.
I like the idea of Jesus, Cleopatra, Newton, not Fig Newton, but Isaac Newton, George Washington. And then I think if you're going to have this, then you're going to want to tell other people about it. So you need a good storyteller. So then I would pick Morgan Freeman, because he seems like he's very thoughtful. He's a person of this time, which has lived and seen a lot of things just in our time. And it's going to be a great voice for when you make the documentary about it.
I saw a little meme just last week that said the perfect death is shot by Clint Eastwood and narrated by Morgan Freeman.
Nice. Yeah, it's a good one. All right. Good answers.
Socrates, I think the reason he is so stuck in my head, I mean, we know a fair amount about, for a guy who never wrote a word, we know a fair amount about him. But when I was in college, I got out of college in 1966. And every man in America who graduated from college in 1966 had a choice for graduation trips. And the choice was Canada or Vietnam. And I remember, I mean, even as a kid, even at 21 years old, with one philosophy class in college, certainly not a philosophy major, I remember that Socrates had said, when the polis calls, a man only has one of two choices. He either goes or he stands in the town square and says, I will not, do to me what you will. And simply the result of that insight, I have always been a huge admirer of Muhammad Ali, who wouldn't go, but he didn't run to Canada or anywhere else. He just said, I'm not going to go. I think his famous line is, how can I kill them people?
Yeah.
But he said, do to me what you will. He didn't go anywhere. He lost his license to box. He lost his livelihood for a while. He was reviled for a while, but he just stood up and took it. And so for me, there were a lot of kids that I know that were getting married or trying desperately to get into graduate school, no matter how piss poor the school was, that the education was going to be. I knew a few who went off to Canada, but that wasn't the wisdom. The wisdom was either go or just stand up and say, I'm not gonna. So it affected my young life tremendously, and that's probably why I still linger with him.
Yeah, I like philosophy is its own different thing. Like growing up in the church and having religion, and then you go a philosophy class can wreak havoc on your religious upbringing pretty easily. And then you throw politics in there, and those are some big forces in the world: religion, philosophy, and politics. It's
Yes.
just, I mean, I think they're all related, but
Well, I mean, this our conversation we're having fun now, but I think of myself as a religious man. But the truth of the matter is that there aren't religions that I adhere to. I am more of a deist. And I think the honest truth is that if I can live to the 10 commandments without any other thought, that's probably as good as I'm going to do.
yeah, those aren't bad. Have you seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure? The movie?
No, I never did. I never did see it. I never did see it.
That has Socrates in it. So I would say put that on your list of things to check out, because you can get a little insight into how Socrates would be to hang out with based on that movie.
Well, when they tried him for corruption of Athenian youth and found him guilty and sentenced him to death, my readings, and I'm not sure this is right because it's not like Plato said it or I've got an original source on it. But my understanding is that everybody thought he was simply going to bribe his way out of jail and run to Thebes. Nobody actually thought he was going to drink that hemlock. Yeah. But he lived by his own rules. He either said, I will either do what the city tells me to do, or I will take whatever punishment they mete out.
It was Socrates' Muhammad Ali moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think probably the other way around. I think Muhammad Ali had a Socrates moment, but it may be the same thing.
I know. That's why it's more fun to say it the other way. Yeah. Plus, time's a disc and it's all happened. So, who knows what came first?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. What is the best way for people to stay apprised of what you're writing and to see what you have written?
Let's see, two things. The first one is I've got a pretty good website. And when I say it's a pretty good website, it does two things. It gives professional reviews, Kirkus, Seattle Review of Books, San Francisco Book Review, Midwest Book Review, professional reviews, not my best friend at Amazon said it was brilliant. It contains professional reviews and it contains summaries of all of my books. So it's pretty easy to go there and say, this is worth me wasting my time. I'm not too worried about saying this is worth wasting my $16.95 because anybody who wants to read a book and really wants to is going to pay the $16.95. But the question is the time that we give to it, not the money we give to it. And so that's a pretty good one. Again, it's just www.samfosterbooks.com. And the other one is, and you and I haven't talked about this, but I write for Substack, and I write twice a week. And that is, if you're not used to Substack or plug in, Substack is an electronic newspaper. You get it for free. There are according to Substack, there are some 20 million people in America now who write on Substack. Now, they might not write it daily or even weekly. I've got one friend who writes only when he's inspired, and he writes on Substack, but it might be once every 6 weeks. And of those people, the writers on Substack, if you're not, and I'm only saying this if you're not familiar with it, have the choice of saying, I give out my content for free, or you have to pay for my content. That's entirely up to the writer. But if the writer says you have to pay for my content, and he can state the price, whether it's so much a year or so much a month, he can state it in pretty much any way he wants to state it. But Substack takes 10%. And so if the writer doesn't charge, Substack is simply providing the platform to put it in. My platform in particular, I have two different ways, and a lot of writers do this. I put out content on Wednesdays and Sundays, and the content is always free on Wendy and Sunday, save that there is a paywall at the bottom of the content, which is paid. And that paid stuff is chapters of my books. So you can read my commentaries for absolutely free. And if you want to read one of the books and you're willing to put up with the Charles Dickens format of Sunday afternoons in the newspaper, then you can pay for my books that way too. But you just read. On Wednesdays, it's always a column that is entitled Bromides, Old Saws, Vignettes, and maybe a little wisdom. And it tends to be things like the conversation you and I are having, TR, that I might use a quote from Socrates, but then not just the quote, but then apply it to daily life where that fit in. Most of them are humorous. Most of them are not too heavy. Most of them are humorous. And on Sundays, I try to make the same kinds of commentaries exactly, save that they will always have a religious or more commonly a spiritual theme. I try to honor the Sunday and put out, but not make it long speeches, not make it boring. I never preach. That's not the point. I'll just put out a quote that somebody might find thoughtful. And that is at Substack. It's Sam Foster, my name, .substack.com.
All right.
And I would say to any of your readers who are thinking, well, this guy said a couple of things that that make me think he might be interested, but I'm not sure. You can either go to the website and look at the summary of the books and the quotes from professional reviewers, or you can go to Substack and simply look at what I'm putting out on Substack and say, nah, I don't think he's my guy, or yeah, I'd like to try to read this for a few weeks and see if I like it enough to pay for it.
Okay. Yeah. Good summary of what Substack is. And I do like your website. It's a good looking website. So.
Oh, good. Thanks for that. Thanks for the compliment on that, TR. Thank you.
I'll put both of those links will be in the show notes. So if anybody didn't write those down or couldn't remember them, then they're in the show notes with the links.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I appreciate your time today. Any thoughts in closing?
No, you and I have had a pretty complete and far-ranging discussion, and I've enjoyed it. I mean, it's clear to me that you're a guy I'd like to sit in a bar with and have a couple of drinks while the football game is going on the big screen TV. You're a most interesting man, and I have found this really interesting. You've taught me a couple of things I didn't know, and all of it was delightful.
Yeah, it's a good talk. I appreciate your time. All right. So
thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe when I come out with Thy Mother is a Lioness, maybe I can send you a few clips. Maybe I send you an electronic version. Maybe you want to invite me back.
Sure. Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. I'll talk to you on the other side of this.
Okay. Thanks, TR.